Was Paul Feyerabend the biggest enemy of the scientific revolution? If you search online using the term worst enemy of science, you will find articles about a philosopher named Paul Feyerabend. You can find blog posts on Scientific American and books on Amazon. This term originated from a 1987 article published by the International Weekly Journal of Science, Nature. In the article, Feyerabend was described as the Salvador Dali of academic philosophy and was said to be the worst enemy of science at that time. However, it is essential to note that this article was published over 3 decades ago. Anything more recent about Feyerabend will suggest that this was an exaggeration. For example, the book on Amazon by John Preston and Gonzalo Munivar states in the preface, Paul Feyerabend, who was once described in Nature as the worst enemy of science, was no enemy of science. On the contrary, he showed how complex and exciting science is, and how it may become at once more fruitful and more humane. Another collection of essays published in 2021 confirms this. The authors, Pskier and Shaw, wrote, "Since then, there has been an exponential increase of interest in Feyerabend's philosophy, with numerous conferences and papers. It seems like now, more than ever, we are in a position to start taking Feyerabend seriously again. I think it's great that more people are interested in Feyerabend's work. He was a brilliant thinker who deserves more attention." That being said, some disagree with those who interpret his work positively. These people point to why he was initially viewed as an opponent of science. Feyerabend's most famous book is Against Method, Outline of an Anarchist Theory of Knowledge. In the opening chapter, he says, "Always remember that the demonstrations and rhetorics used do not express any deep convictions of mine. They merely show how easy it is to lead people by the nose in a rational way. An anarchist is like an undercover agent who plays the game of reason to undercut the authority of reason, truth, honesty, justice, and so on." Just think about the implications of this statement for a moment. Feyerabend tells us that he's writing in bad faith and that we can't take his words at face value. Because he's not playing by any rules, it means that he doesn't have to be fair, consistent, or even honest. And what could be worse in an age of fake news and alternative facts? To quote John Horgan from Scientific American, "The weirder things get, the more relevant Paul Feyerabend becomes." Paul Feyerabend was an Austrian philosopher born in Vienna in 1924. He was one of the most significant thinkers of the 20th century, challenging the traditional view of science as a methodical and rational process. Feyerabend's father was a civil servant, and his mother was a seamstress. Feyerabend wrote his autobiography in the final years of his life, which he barely completed before he died in 1994. His autobiography provides an intimate account of his life, including his childhood, experiences during World War II, and academic career. In his recollections, he portrays his formative years as perplexing, where his surroundings were often fraught with chaos and peculiar occurrences. One particular memory that stands out was when he witnessed a classmate break down in tears upon learning that the concepts of angels and Santa Claus were not real. While this display of emotion was poignant, it was no more or less impactful than the scenes of destruction and violence he witnessed firsthand during the Civil War of 1934 in Vienna. The images of lifeless bodies strewn about the streets and bloodstains marking the sidewalks were seared into his mind and remained a haunting reminder of the horrors of war. In that autobiography, he wrote, "Words and events that could have changed my attitude made no impression whatsoever. I noticed them, but I did not connect them with my beliefs." During high school, Paul Feyerabend found himself drawn to the worlds of literature and acting. As a student, he was required to read books bundled with classic philosophers such as Descartes and Plato. This was his first encounter with the dramatic possibilities of reasoning and the immense power arguments seemed to hold over people. Despite his love for the humanities, Feyerabend was also profoundly inspired by his physics teacher, Oswald Thomas. Thomas would organize monthly stargazing events in a meadow outside of Vienna, and Feyerabend found himself captivated by the mysteries of the universe revealed through these sessions. Meanwhile, his interest in drama evolved into a lifelong passion for singing, which would remain with him throughout his life. According to words in his autobiography, he stated, "The course of my life was clear. theoretical astronomy during the day, then rehearsals, coaching, vocal exercises, opera in the evening, and astronomical observation at night. The only remaining obstacle was the war. Upon completing high school, Feyerabend was sent to Germany for military training. In 1942, he embarked on a long journey that would take him from France to Vienna, Yugoslavia, and the Russian front in Poland. Both physical and emotional trauma marked Feyerabend's experiences during this time. In January 1945, while retreating from the Russian army, he was shot in the spine, which temporarily paralyzed him from the waist down. Despite this setback, he regained his ability to walk within a year, albeit with the aid of a cane. Unfortunately, Feyerabend was impotent for the rest of his life due to the injury. After World War II ended, Feyerabend returned to his family's home in Vienna. However, only his father remained, as his mother had committed suicide in 1943. This was another tragic event in Feyerabend's life, but he seemed detached. When he received news of his mother's death, Feyerabend's fellow soldiers were shocked and dismayed by his seemingly cold and unemotional response. He recalls being referred to as cold and unmoved during her funeral. Despite these challenges, Feyerabend became a prominent philosopher of science, known for his critiques of scientific methodology and support for epistemological anarchism. However, his experiences during World War II undoubtedly left a lasting impact on him, shaping his worldview and approach to philosophy. At 21, Feyerabend remained strangely disconnected from the world around him. At this point, he returned to the University of Vienna and became serious about academics. He rekindled his love for physics and astronomy, but was gradually drawn back to the dramatic reasoning of philosophy. In the mid-century, the most dominant school of philosophy was logical positivism. It was developed in Vienna through the 20s and 30s, meaning that Feyerabend was too young to be a part of this original group. Still, he was just in time to explore one of its many branching disciplines, in this case, the philosophy of science. Feyerabend wrote on topics like empiricism and scientific methods, which earned his approval. However, according to his autobiography, he only repeats the attitude of the logical positivists, so he wrote thus: "Science is the basis of knowledge, science is empirical, non-empirical enterprises are either logic or nonsense." The 1950s were a period of intellectual expansion for Feyerabend as he established his reputation in Vienna and eventually across Europe. He was stimulated by personal encounters with thinkers like Ludwig Wittgenstein, Karl Popper, Niels Bohr, Viktor Kraft, David Bohm, and Thomas Kuhn. These were some of the great minds that helped to shape Feyerabend through the 1950s. Feyerabend was not without inspiration, but his perspective was still confined to the academy. He was not yet a provocateur. Something needed to connect with his emotions and change his attitude, which is exactly what happened while he was teaching in the 1960s at the University of California, Berkeley. Over 2 months, the University of California, Berkeley, witnessed frequent student rallies that gained momentum and caught people's attention. As a result, discussions around the events began to surface. The free speech movement was a massive student protest at Berkeley throughout the first half of the 1960s. The school administration was eventually forced to recognize this political activity on campus and adapt its policies in response, and Feyerabend was right there in the middle of it. Let's see how he reacted to this by noting what he wrote in his book. Feyerabend wrote, "In the years following 1964, Mexicans, blacks, and Indians entered the university as a result of new educational policies. There they sat, partly curious, partly disdainful, partly simply confused, hoping to get an education. What an opportunity for a prophet in search of a following. What an opportunity, my rationalist friends told me, to contribute to the spreading of reason and the improvement of mankind. What a marvelous opportunity for a new wave of enlightenment. I felt very differently. For it dawned on me that the intricate arguments and the wonderful stories I had so far told to my more or less sophisticated audience might just be dreams, reflections of the conceit of a small group who had succeeded in enslaving everyone else with their ideas. Who was I to tell these people what and how to think? These were the ideas that went through my head as I looked at my audience, and they made me recoil in revulsion and terror from the task I was supposed to perform." For the task this now became clear to me was that of a very refined, very sophisticated slave driver, and a slave driver I did not want to be. Finally, the chaos of the external world had reached Feyerabend. The freedom movement at Berkeley connected with his belief system and changed his attitude. By the 1970s, Feyerabend had abandoned logical positivism. It was time for something radical, something that would move the philosophical community in the same way that Berkeley students had moved its administration. It was time for Against Method. Against Method is a collage of writings centered on the idea that the means of knowledge production needed to be disrupted. In other words, epistemology needs anarchy. As the title suggests, Feyerabend defends the view that there is no universal method for knowledge production, including the concept of a scientific method. If we wanted such a method to exist, it could only be expressed by the phrase, anything goes. Reviewers of Against Method read this slogan as a form of extreme relativism, where science is just as valid as astrology or voodoo. But it's more nuanced than that. Feyerabend was trying to redirect our attention away from evidence, experiments, and facts toward persuasion, marketing, and propaganda. He claims that these factors are severely overlooked, which has distorted our understanding of what science is. The most detailed example he uses to support this claim is Galileo. Today, Galileo is recognized as a scientific genius who stood up for truth against the oppression of religion. According to Feyerabend and Against Method, anyone who decides to take such a stand would find themselves faced not with arguments, which they could most likely answer, but with an impenetrable stone wall of well-entrenched reactions. Thus, Galileo faced some well-entrenched reactions in making his case for the motion of the Earth, one of which was the so-called tower argument. If the Earth were moving, dropping an object from any height would result in a small amount of horizontal displacement. Of course, we don't see this happen at all. Objects fall straight down, therefore, the Earth is at rest. This was basically irrefutable or, as Feyerabend describes it, a natural interpretation. Now, we all know that Galileo was ultimately successful in altering our understanding of falling objects. But according to what Feyerabend wrote in Against Method, this was not because he had access to special evidence or facts, but because he uses psychological tricks in addition to whatever intellectual reasons he has to offer. These tricks are very successful, they lead him to victory. But they obscure the new attitude towards experience that is in the making. They obscure the fact that the experience on which Galileo wants to base the Copernican view is nothing but the result of his own fertile imagination, that it has been invented. Okay, so you might be wondering why Feyerabend would claim that Galileo invented the basis for heliocentrism and what evidence he could have to support this. There's enough material for multiple videos, but Galileo is just a case study for Feyerabend. His main point is this: as famous as Galileo was, and as pivotal as the scientific revolution was, they have not and will not give us a reliable method for producing scientific knowledge. The same holds for any paradigm shift. You have to examine each one on a case-by-case basis. There is no golden rule for progress. Furthermore, Feyerabend claimed that his contemporaries, like Karl Popper, were hypocrites because, on the one hand, they praised Galileo as a scientific genius, while at the same time, they would have sent him away as a heretic if they had been his contemporary in the 17th century. Naturally, Feyerabend was heavily criticized for Against Method. He was mostly accused of being inconsistent, claiming one thing here and then opposing it there. People were suspicious. How does an anarchist defend themselves against rational criticism? Feyerabend grew exasperated that he wrote this. Somewhere in the middle of the commotion, I grew rather depressed. I often wished I had never written that fucking book. Nevertheless, Feyerabend doubled down on his position 3 years later with the release of his book Science in a Free Society. This book is more political. For example, in the chapter titled Science is One Ideology Among Many and Should Be Separated from the State just as religion is now separated from the state, he also responded to his critics directly in a section called Conversations with Illiterates. Feyerabend would continue lecturing at Berkeley and other European schools until the early 90s. He retired after marrying his fourth and final wife, Grazia Barini, and his final manuscript was published posthumously as Conquest of Abundance. His later writings expanded into history and culture, spreading his ideas beyond philosophy. However, the recent interest in Feyerabend is focused mainly on his philosophical significance, bringing us back to whether or not Paul Feyerabend was the worst enemy of science. There's a parallel with Galileo here. Against method also generated a wall of well-entrenched reactions instead of legitimate counterarguments. So, Feyerabend took a page out of Galileo's book and used psychological tricks to get his point across. Does this mean that he was writing in bad faith? I think it's more accurate to say that Paul Feyerabend was an esoteric writer. The meaning of his text is contained between the lines, and you have to read him very carefully to understand what he's trying to teach us. I'll have some more evidence and explanations in my next video, but in the meantime, let me know what you think about Feyerabend. Was he the worst enemy of science?